Hello and welcome. I'm Brian Caplen, editor of The Banker. I'm here with Tim Skeet, who's a senior advisor for the International Capital Markets Association, and we're talking about bail-in. Tim, there's been some new rules in Europe on bail-in. So can we start by explaining how it's all supposed to work?
How it's supposed to work is a very good question. We don't really know as yet because of the experimental nature of it. But very simply, they've rejigged insolvency practice as it applies to banks. In other words, in the old days, a bank was regarded as much as any other corporate was regarded. If it went bust, in would go the liquidator, the administrator, under the guidance of the regulator in theory. But of course, what they've now done and said, that's not what we want. Banks are systemically important. They matter too much to our society. Therefore, the regulators will actually determine what happens. So we've created a bail-in regime.
All right, and in that bail-in regime, it means that the bondholders and the equity holders, they get wiped out first.
Well, yes,
before the government steps.
That's exactly right. Because remember that under the old, in theory, insolvency regime we had before, banks never were allowed to become insolvent. What really happened is government stepped in, used taxpayers' money to bail them out.
All right, so now that's the theory.
That was what happened before.
Now let's go to the situation in Italy in June, where we saw these two small banks rescued. How did the operation work there?
Well, interestingly, you've got two different situations which have happened almost at the same time, because the new regime means that, as you rightly pointed, shareholders and wholesale lenders to banks are the ones that now bear a lot of the capital cost of a restructuring. So you basically sell off or refloat a bank under these new arrangements. And basically, that's what the regulator now has the power to come and do. And they've super subordinated a lot of the wholesale lenders. In the case of Spain, which is interesting, Banco Popular, the tier one holders, the most risky notes issued by the bank, the COCOs as they're called, and of course shareholders, plus the tier two, which is subordinated dated debt, all got wiped out.
All right.
Not what happened in Italy exactly.
Okay, because in Italy we saw at least 5 billion euros of government money going in with 12 billion of guarantees.
Well, that's right, because if they bailed in a lot of the wholesale lenders in Spain, spun it off to Banco Santander, what they did in Italy was they effectively put the taxpayers' money back on the line. Now, there's a good reason for this, and in fact, it's all about clearing up the legacy issues. And some of the work we've done for the ICMA is exactly that. We've often challenged the ECB and say, look, bailing in wholesale lenders is entirely appropriate. It is right that taxpayers are no longer on the hook for this kind of thing. But let's clear up the legacy mess first. And of course, Italy has been challenged by very high levels of NPLs, banks that are not easily resolved.
So what you're saying really is you think it's acceptable for the Italians to have taken the approach they have, given the circumstances?
I think given the circumstances, Brian, it was a very pragmatic policy response. They had to slip it through the EU mechanisms and the competition law. But at the end of the day, they are clearing up the legacy issues. So what we want to do is reset the banking agenda.
And so does the experience of Spain with Popular, which has been bought by Santander, does that suggest that we are on course with the bail-in rules, that they are going to be conformed to?
Well, in many ways, Banco Popular was seen by many as a good example of how it should work in practice. Exactly. And we're beginning to see the whole principle actually put into the real world, as it were, and a real working example. Now, some of the investors, as you will know, still have concerns over the way in which that was done, the valuation placed upon the Banco Popular, the price at which Santander took over the assets, and so on and so forth. And there will always be questions. One of the problems I think still outstanding is because that process is not fully transparent. In theory it is, in practice it's not, and then investors are still sitting there thinking, hang on, was this fair? The Italy situation is different.
Isn't it the case there's always going to be a little bit of a sort of government involvement? It's never quite a pure textbook case. Every case of a bailout is
well, I think this is exactly the point. So clearly what they've done, what the regulators have done in conjunction with a lot of experts is look at the industry and say, well, what do we do basically to ring fence the taxpayer and make the whole thing more equitable from a society's point of view? And they've made huge strides in that direction. But does it really work in practice? Can it be that the entire banking system doesn't ever need the public purse? And the point being, I think even the regulators now recognize that for liquidity purposes, there will always be the need for the public purse to stand behind systemic runs on liquidity across the system.
Tim, thank you very much for your comments.
Pleasure.